Hello, I'm here with Dr. Tom King, and we're going to talk about his very innovative Saturn school that he was project director of. And he's going to tell us a little about this innovative school, how it got started, and how this could be possible today. Hello, Dr. King. How are you?
Hi, Shelly. Terrell, it's wonderful to meet you, even if it is just online.
Great to meet you, too. Can you tell us a little about how the Saturn school is very different than the public schools that most educators are used to?
I'd be glad to. You cut me off if I get going too long on this. I'm going to use a low-tech approach with our high-tech approach today. This was me back in 1960, and you can see I'm leaning over helping a student with her textbook because she was working on her homework problems, right? Okay. Even though I was never considered the most efficient, best organized teacher, it always bothered me how inefficient our means of learning was, even back in the 60s, for all students to learn more. I think my motto, even as a young teacher, became more students ought to be learning more. Education is very, very inefficient. So I went off to graduate school thinking I'd find more answers to that. I worked on my doctorate, and of course I just ended up finding out more questions. Not enough answers. So back in 1970, this is where I am now. This is, 40 years ago, we had a teletype machine that was hooked up to a computer in Chicago. And we were having the students write their own computer programs to help them develop a logical way to solve problems. And it occurred to me throughout my career that although teachers make a superhuman, superb effort, I'm a real pro-teacher kind of person, that the system actually got in the way of better education happening for more kids. So I used to talk about it in some of the graduate education classes I taught. And then, lo and behold, and late in my career, when I was in my 50s, and not that far from retirement, a new superintendent came to town in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is where I taught, where I worked. At that time, I was in administration. I had developed, one of the advantages of a little later in your career was I had developed a number of friends in higher ed, in the union movement, both locally in our St. Paul Federation of Teachers, and even nationally with Al Shanker, who was the president of the American Federation of Teachers. I had contacts in the educational technology field, both hardware and software. And so I floated some ideas on them about how could we create a school, what would this school look like in which more students were more successful? How could we make use of the tools? How could we make use of some of the best ideas we know in improving learning? And so I kind of ran that by the superintendent, the new superintendent in the elevator one day, and I think he used the standard response he gave to everybody who was hitting on him for new ideas, and he said, well, why don't you see if you can write a 1 or 2 page paper on what you're talking about? Well, fortunately, I had that in my pocket, literally, and I gave it to him, and he said, well, let's see if you can raise some money. And we did, and things fell into place. We got funding. He was able to get support from the board. We had some very, very interested parents, even though it was a public school. This was before the days of charter. It was a magnet school in St. Paul, Minnesota that addressed kids to start with from grades 4 to 6, because it was a downtown school. We didn't want very young children at that time being in a downtown school, although we ended up adding them later. And then our hope was to expand it not only for grades 7 and 8, but even on to high school. But because things change in time, even good ideas, all of that never came to pass. But a lot of wonderful things did, and I'm very, very pleased with the effort we made at school reform. That's a nutshell.
Okay,
it's an awful big nutshell, but that's the nutshell.
No problem. And what did the typical class look like that's very different than today's classes, where you walk in and you observe teachers in the front and rows of desks? So how did the Saturn school classes differ?
Well, I think you could probably say that the teachers became partners in learning. I don't have a picture of the teacher in this, but the teacher was somewhere around these two kids who were playing with their computers. The teachers became partners, and the teachers said, "Teach me." And so they didn't consider themselves the fount of all information. They considered themselves as facilitators and coaches and cheerleaders and affirmers. And a lot of times students would come up and ask them a question, "Well, how do you do this?" And the teacher, even if they didn't know the answer, would feign ignorance and say, "Well, gosh, I don't know. Why don't you get together with so-and-so and so-and-so and come back and tell me?" Now, I'm not saying we dealt with all questions that way, but it became a very, very different environment for learning.
And so were the students allowed to experiment more? Were the classes longer?
Yes, yes, and yes. We threw away.
Okay.
We threw away a lot of rules. One of the people who was very instrumental in my thinking about school reform was a professor I had at the University of Wisconsin-Madison back in the late 60s, 1960s. That's how far back this goes. He said, instead of just taking one powerful idea and researching it in education, wouldn't it make an awful lot more sense to gather together 5 or 6 or 7 powerful ideas and put them together, see if you can make a difference with a bigger, more powerful set of ideas, and then tease out the differences, then find out which are having greater impact. So what we tried to do at Saturn was use several different concepts of what we thought would be effective. One, we had a personal learning plan owned by each student with help from their parents, their advisor, their teacher, and any other mentors that were involved. We wanted them to take greater responsibility for their learning, which is ironic in today's world where everybody's trying to blame the teacher for shortcomings in learning. We were trying to encourage the learner to become primarily responsible for their own learning. If you don't have that, you don't have learning. That's my belief anyway. We tried to empower the teachers. We actually had longer school year, longer school day. We had a principal in name, but most of the power was left to the teachers. They actually made more money than principals did at this school. We got agreement between the union and our school board. And I remember one of the principals in the district coming up to me and saying, "How can you be paying them more than a principal?" And I said, "They know more and they're working harder." I did it with a laugh. I wasn't trying to anger them, but we did. We required a lot from them, and they made more money. Third thing, we insisted on parents being a key part of the education of their child. And we told them if their youngster was going to go to our school, it was a magnet school that they could choose, but we were not interested in having students in the schools unless the parents were going to be a part of it. So we required them to be at numerous conferences during the year, personal learning conferences. The student took charge, but the parents were there too. That was critical. We also made use of the resources within the city for our classes. The kids would, since we were downtown, we would walk, or if it was a little longer, they'd be school bused to the Science Museum or to the Art Museum, or for visiting various kinds of job opportunities in the real world. So they had mentors in the city as well. And we used technology, at least at that time, as well as we could to help them with their learning. So those were some of the key things that we brought into it.
And for this to happen today, it's crazy that, we're still talking how these ideas are still what our children need. And it's been, so many years. What would need to happen for a school like that to take place now?
Well, you've got to break some rules. And that's it's really hard to do in education because there are so many rules. And I think there are more of them today than there were back then. So I think charter schools afford a wonderful opportunity for this to happen. And it allows you to set up a school according to your own set of principles and to try to make them work. It's a very difficult process in a school district, a public school district, because of all the regulations that are in place. And one of the things that caused our Saturn school such great difficulties later and ultimately led to its demise was standardized testing. Excuse me. We were doing a lot with portfolio-based learning. And so we were concentrating on that. We were trying to use technology to teach the basic skills. Well, the kids fell a little bit behind, and their standardized test scores dropped a little bit. And the newspaper, which had been covering what we were doing, ran a headline, Saturn School has failing grades, or something like that, or poor test scores. And before we knew it, our waiting list of over 300 kids to get into the school had dropped to near zero. So it shows you what a negative impact that a bad press and also standardized test scores can cause for change in education, because you're held to standards that, quite frankly, I think don't make an awful lot of sense anyway.
I absolutely agree with you on the standardized testing and how it doesn't really measure learning very well at all, and for most kids. That's an important point to bring up, though. I think one thing that does measure the learning is the children themselves. So have you heard from any of these children now that they're adults, basically, and what are some of the success stories that that you can share with us?
Well, I wish I could tell you that the laws of data privacy made it a lot easier to do follow-up on this, in addition to the fact that as kids get older, many of them move, go on to school. We don't have a simple way to find them. Excuse me. But let me tell you maybe what would be a good sort of, as we get nearer to closing story here. See this picture? Okay. This is, I'm sure you recognize, is President George Bush Sr., or whatever he's called, 40, I forget, whatever designation. He's sitting there talking to one of our students, whose name was Elijah. Now, Elijah was kind of counseled into our school the second year of our operation because he hadn't been doing very well at the school he had been before. And somebody over there said, well, why don't you go over to Saturn? Maybe they can help you there. Well, it turned out we could, and we had some of our best results with students who were having difficulty because of our personal learning plan, quite frankly. And when he came to school the first 6 months or whatever it was, he had a hard time because he hadn't really been used to being more responsible for his learning. But he got really turned on. If you remember from the picture I just showed you, you may have recognized some what we used to call Lego logo projects sitting right in front of him. That's what he was showing to the president. And what the kids did was built these Lego devices, and then with little motors and pulleys and things like that, they would write computer programs to make them do things. So when President Bush told us he was coming to the school, we couldn't have all of the kids talking to the president at one time. We selected a few, and one of them was Elijah. And he got a chance to show his project to the president. And after the visit was over, I went out the next morning on my way to school, and I saw this copy of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. And when I saw Elijah in school, I said, my word, you got a chance to make the front cover? I said, it looked like the president, let me show you one more time, was asking you a hard question. He looks like Rodin's thinker in that picture, doesn't he? I said, it looked like he was asking you a hard question. He said, yes, he was. He asked me, what do I like about computers? And he said, I had to think about that for a while, and he said, what I like most about computers is that they let me work with my hands. and my brain. He said, I'm not a great reader yet. I'm not a good writer yet, but computers make me better at what I do. I thought, well, what a wonderful message to go from a student to the President of the United States. I wish it had impacted more people, quite frankly. But to get to the answer to your question, Elijah was a kid, and nobody can predict the future, and certainly I couldn't back then either. But there was a kid that's, if he had finished high school at all, it would have been unusual for a lot of our kids because they don't in an inner city school. But he did. Okay. And I have come to find out that he not only finished high school, but he went on to our technical vocational school in St. Paul. And I understand he completed the program there and was gainfully employed and happy at what he was doing. So I think we had dozens of stories like that, and I wish I could find a way to tell more of them, because I think that's what would better drive school reform and change in our country today. The kids need to tell the story. That's one reason I like to have people look at our little YouTube video that the students made called There's No Place Like School, which I think you have posted on your blog site somewhere, don't you?
Yes, and I'll post the link as well. I'll share it with this video.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us and sharing these fantastic ideas on school reform. And I understand that if schools or parties are interested in finding out how to establish a school like Saturn, that you'll Skype with them, with the school. Is that correct?
Oh, I absolutely love to help people try new things out. I think we have to keep pushing the edges of the envelope. There are answers out there, and you have to keep looking for them, and you never, never, never give up, and certainly on your dreams for change.
Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Best wishes.